We're
Oh,
now live on YouTube. Good luck, everyone.
thanks, Letitia. I'll just do a little bit of, we'll do a little bit of patter while people are dialing on, Zelina.
Okay.
Everyone, you're in the right place. This is the Climate Bonds webinar on ASEAN economies exposure to climate risk. Or in fact, this is the launch of the report we've done on the topic, and you're going to hear more about that in a minute. We've still got people dialing in and joining in. It always takes a few seconds. This webinar is also live on YouTube and will be available as a recording on YouTube afterwards on the Climate Bonds Initiative YouTube channel. Just search for Climate Bonds Initiative. We'll get started in just a minute formally. And Letitia, our producer, perhaps you can just tell me when you think we should get going.
I think we can start.
Okay. I'm Sean Kidney. I'm the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. I'm just here to introduce our really fantastic group of speakers and panelists, and I want you to note something special. This is an all-women panel, once I get out of the way, of course, talking about sustainable finance in a way that exemplifies, I'm going to say, the leadership of women in sustainable finance. It really is a movement that has so many fantastic women working on it, very different to the finance sector generally, which is still dominated by men in suits. So we hope to see a revolution which will be matched by the larger revolution we must see, which is around green finance and transitioning to low carbon and climate resilient economies. You kind of know what the challenge is. We have a total catastrophe that we're heading into at the moment, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that was issued a few weeks ago. We have the impacts of climate coming our way. And it's not just the terrible heat incidences that we've seen in the Indian subcontinent the last few weeks, really astounding heat way out of order of the time of year, and the consequence impacts on people and the electricity system, which keeps going to blackouts and so on and so on. But, you know, when we look at the last 2 years, we've started to see the impacts of human activity on the planet, climate change in particular. The pandemic was a function of the collapse of biodiversity in southern China and Southeast Asia. We have been told by the IPCC Health Committee to expect lots of pandemics this century. We will see them as a feature of climate change. We will see, well, wars. We have at the moment in the Ukraine, a war being waged by an autocratic leader of a petrostate using revenues from petroleum and gas from Europe to finance a war. This is a petrostate war. This is part of the transition, if you like, to a different kind of war and the resistance by some parties. And of course, we have famine stalking the planet now because of the extraordinary increase in food prices as a result of that petrostate war. You know, the last time we saw climate change significantly in the 1600s, we saw 2 degrees cooling because we killed off so many American Indians in the 1500s of smallpox and measles and so on. The forestry growth in the Amazon sucked so much carbon out of the atmosphere, according to research from Stanford, that we saw cooling. In that 100 years of cooling, when we lost 1/3 of the world's population, remember that, 1/3 of the world's population, the way they experienced it was pandemics, war, and famine. That's how we would experience climate change. It won't be gently rising sea levels on the Singapore or Jakarta waterfront. It'll be severe volatility, which of course will be a challenge for our financial sector in terms of forward stability, how to ensure that our savings are kept there, ensure that our economies can thrive, is a deep, difficult challenge for us. Today, we're going to hear a little bit more about the more general aspects of this from Lily Burge, who's going to present the findings of our report on the topic. We're not going to talk about war and famine and pandemics so much. I'm just going to put that through on your agenda as a background point. In the meantime, there's a whole bunch of metrics that we need to start addressing, even within the existing confines of our economy. We are blessed to have a collection of women who are leaders in their particular sector. I will let Zelina Shamshuddin, who's our head of Asia Pac, introduce them in a minute. But I want to sign off and say we are making progress in ASEAN. Whilst we have vast capital needs to shift our planet, our economies, our societies, our ASEAN economies to becoming low carbon and climate resilient, which is a challenge. We had McKinsey say a few weeks ago that it had to be about $9.2 trillion per annum shifting globally, with a consequent share around the economies. We also know that we have the solutions technologically, and we know that the capital will go green if we give it a chance to. We've seen now the rise of the green and sustainable bond market, which is sitting at around $3 trillion outstanding globally, an extraordinary growth in the last few years, more growth expected this year. And we see the participation in ASEAN. First, we saw things like the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum of Regulators issue green bond guidelines, which have been translated into Securities Commission guidelines around the region. We've seen issuance by all sorts of banks and corporations in the sector. And we've also seen sovereign issuance become a feature of the region, with Indonesia leading the way with its extensive program of green and sustainable sukuk. But we've also seen Malaysia do a sustainable sukuk last year. We've seen Thailand issue its sustainability bonds and its green bonds. And we now know from the news that Philippines and Singapore are looking at something this year. These are symptomatic developments of the underlying changes in the economy. Of course, there's more we need to do. That's for sure. This challenge is no small challenge. This challenge is a huge challenge. But progress is happening. And capital is voting at its feet. These bonds are doing fabulously in the market. They are being oversubscribed. They are attracting new investors. They are serving the issuers very well, which is a marker of the extent to which capital will move if we give it the opportunity to move. Folks, it's exciting that work is happening in the area. In the meantime, Lily, over to you to present the findings of the report, and then over to Zalina to run the panel. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today.
Thank you, Sean. Zalina, could you share the slides, please? Thanks. So we'll just go straight to the context of the report, please. Thanks. So ASEAN has really high vulnerability to climate-related risks, both physical and transition. And its transition risk vulnerability stems from its fossil fuel-dominated energy mix. There's 80% of total energy supply in 2018, I think, is fossil fuels, and several nations are highly reliant on fossil fuel export revenue. So this exposes it to global and local transition risks. So next slide, please, Lina. So this report aims to raise awareness of the risks arising from this reliance and prompt action to start tackling these risks, not only by ASEAN central banks, but also by other financial market participants. And so next, please. And next again, thanks. And so what are climate-related risks? So we are focusing here mostly on transition risks. I've sort of outlined both of them here for you for sort of completeness. But the transition risks we're looking at are here specifically ones stemming from the energy transition, as this is where most transition efforts are. So though it's worth bearing in mind that transition risks can arise from other transition efforts, which sort of move to circular economy and so on. And these transition risks can be categorized into policy change, technological developments, and investor or consumer sentiment change. But these three risk drivers are quite closely interconnected. So policy making is driven by voter expectations, technology costs are influenced by government subsidies or scaling measures, and consumer preferences are influenced in turn by policy and can also sort of adapt to accept technology cost premiums and so on. And so next, please. So the transmission of climate, one back, please. So transmission of climate-related risks. This figure demonstrates how climate-related risks are transmitted through the microeconomy, so households and businesses, and also the macroeconomy, so sector level and national changes. And vulnerability to these transmission channels is determined by the percentage of fossil fuels in the energy mix, the levels of international lending and investment, and domestic banks' exposure to vulnerable assets, and so on. And there's no set transmission channel for each type of risk, which is worth kind of bearing in mind that any one transition risk will be transmitted through multiple channels through both the micro and macro economy. And the sort of weighting of each channel is dependent on the structure of the economy. So a ban on coal-fired power would be channeled through the micro economy if most of the power sector was privatized, or through the macro economy if it was mostly state-owned. And these channels also vary quite a lot depending on reliance on foreign investment. So, net fossil fuel exporters and importers will have very different vulnerabilities, driven either by external demand or supply dynamics. And these risks are magnified by feedback channels, which are really sort of crucial part of determining how strong these risks will be. The financial economy risks which manifest will then kind of turn back to create real economy vulnerability. So, increasing rates of default will constrain banks' lending and increase of stagnation risk, and so on. And then we'll go straight on to some of the risk drivers we've outlined. Miss Lena. So here are some of the policy potential drivers of transition risk in ASEAN. And so the first is coal-related market risk, which will arise due to the global phase-out of coal-fired power. Coal consumption peaked in 2007, and COP26 was sort of seen as sounding a death knell for coal, is what most people sort of said about 40 or so countries pledging to phase out coal more rapidly than their net zero commitments. And Indonesia in particular, it's the world's largest coal exporter, and a decline in coal trade presents a huge stranded asset risk for exporters as they're facing shrinking markets. And then this year, of course, we've seen the sanctions on Russian gas due to the war in Ukraine, presenting a sort of narrative of surge for coal. But any kind of windfalls from the short-term increased coal reliance shouldn't really be seen as a long-term source of stability for the coal market. The EU's REPowerEU plans to reduce their reliance on Russian gas don't include ramping up coal consumption, like does the IEA plan, also for the EU. So instead, windfalls should just be seen as a sort of diversification opportunity, and sort of the regulator will have a role here to send a signal to sort of guide these investments into diversification, into green investment rather than business as usual. So carbon pricing is another key driver of transition risk, which is really growing up the agenda just this year, with particularly the EU's proposed carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM. And this will apply the EU's own carbon price to imports of goods which are covered by the EU's emission trading scheme. So this will increase the tax burden on importers into the EU, and that will reduce the competitiveness of these carbon-intensive export industries. And this impact can be mitigated by implementing local carbon pricing, because then the carbon pricing revenue would be captured locally and able to be reinvested back into the country's economy rather than that revenue being captured by the EU. And then in ASEAN particularly, there is a strong transition risk posed by the long-term power purchase agreements with coal-fired power, because these restrict the government's ability to transition away from coal assets. And this will then discourage renewable energy investment and increases the likelihood of an economic shock from a sudden disorderly transition. So Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam are the first targets of ADB's energy transition mechanism, which aims to buy and retire high emissions coal-fired power. But these countries also have a complex sort of coal lock-in situation, because the coal infrastructure is relatively young, and there's also a very large pipeline of new projects yet to come online. So there's this danger that as these older plants are retired by the ADB's mechanism, other plants will still enter the generation mix, also backed by long-term PPAs, and not sort of break out of that cycle. And now I'll just go on to investor risk, Selena. So ASEAN companies are quite highly dependent on international financial markets for debt, and these are undergoing dramatic changes in investor sentiment and behaviour. So the transition risks mentioned above are increasingly driving institutional investors to reduce their own fossil fuel exposure. So the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ, which was announced at COP26, account for $130 trillion assets under management, and they've made strong commitments to phase out their investments in fossil fuels. And additionally, investors are also prioritizing coal divestment above gas and oil first. So Indonesian and other ASEAN coal companies could increasingly face external financial constraints, and combined with falling demand for coal, I've just outlined, this could increase the risk of loan defaults, constrain balance sheets, and create liquidity problems. So local fossil fuel companies that borrow from international lenders are likely to see an increasing cost of capital as demand for their bonds or equity decreases, or as lenders demand higher interest rates. And this is closely linked to credit risk. So credit risk refers to risks of downgrades of the credit rating by credit rating agencies, which then leads to lower demand for bonds or higher interest rates on loans. And then this credit risk is compounded by investors preemptively demanding a higher risk premium on fossil fuel assets specifically. And this increasing cost of capital has already been seen quite a lot with physical risk exposure. There's been a study showing that the V20 has been cost $62 billion in higher external payments over the last 10 years. And transition risk exposures are expected to have similar impacts in the future. Next slide, please, Lena. So technological advancements in green technologies will also create asset stranding risk for carbon-intensive companies. So for certain countries such as Vietnam, building new solar generation could become cheaper than operating existing coal plants as early as this year. And around the world, renewable energy is becoming increasingly cost competitive with fossil fuels. So combined with the fact that fossil fuel and renewable energy generation capacity in Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam is expected to exceed demand in the coming years, this will lead to underutilization of fossil fuel fired plants, and due to the renewable energy being more cost competitive than the fossil fuels. So this will then reduce the market share and pricing power of fossil fuel companies, and these reduced sales and profits of these companies will lead to decreasing asset value, so resulting in market risk, if we go back to that diagram way back, and also higher default rates or credit risk for the financial institutions that lend to these. And then next slide, please, Lena. We then have these risks kind of combine and compound to really threaten economic stability. So there's the major problem of the risk of a carbon bubble in the valuation of fossil fuel companies, because if under a business as usual approach with growing energy demand in line with economic development, investors might believe that fossil fuel reserves and infrastructure can continue to be commercialized for many years, and then end up overvaluing the stock of these companies, creating this carbon bubble. And this creates a risk that a sudden step up in climate policy or faster adoption of low carbon technology could lead to a sudden fall in value of these assets and a sort of sudden increase in non-performing loans on the balance sheet. And then we also have an issue for sovereign borrowing costs. So particularly for Malaysia and Indonesia, where the governments are highly reliant on fossil fuel revenues, sovereign debt might see an increased risk premium. This has been warned of by Fitch Ratings, that sovereigns, which are major fossil fuel exporters, may see downgrades in their credit rating. And central banks may also exclude carbon-intensive sovereign debt from their foreign reserves, as has been done by Sweden's Riksbank. And then this has also been hinted at by Australia in its long-term emission strategy. Deep in the small print, we found that they've stated that lack of action on climate could cause a spiraling cost of debt as investors demand a premium on this higher risk. So this risk accumulation can threaten national and regional economic stability. So fossil fuel companies may increase reliance on local lenders if international lenders reduce fossil fuel investment, which then exposes not only the industry, but also local financial system to asset stranding risk. And such impacts are likely to be carried through to other nations, as seen in the Asian financial crisis. And these different compounding risks are also closely interrelated, of course, because sovereign risk will increase the cost of lending as downgrades flow through to domestic bank ratings, and this will increase risk default, threatening national economic stability, and so on. And these risks also pose a risk to the region's ability to transition, because investment appraisals will consider overall sovereign risk. So countries with high fossil fuel exposure may find it hard to finance transition efforts, even with green investment, specifically labelled green debt. And so this shows the importance of timely action to reduce fossil fuel exposure, not only just insulating from the risks I've just whistled through, but also to maintain this fiscal space to take action on climate. And now all statements I was making are backed up by our data analysis. So next slide, please, Lena. In the report, we go into this in a lot more detail, but just to give you a sort of taste of it, we've analysed ASEAN bond and loan data from the central bank's Refinitiv Bloomberg, and our analysis revealed, firstly, that there's a lot of carbon-intensive debt and in the region. Particularly Indonesia is very vulnerable, you see in this little graph, with these risks of the high proportion of carbon-intensive debt are also exacerbated by a large reliance on foreign currency lending and US dollar bond issuance. Then additionally, by 2035, the vast majority of the loans in the region will need refinancing. And this poses a risk because if investor sentiment has changed, the terms and conditions of the loan may be very different. So reliance on foreign lending may result in significantly increased costs of capital when these bonds and loans come up for refinancing. So what can central banks do about this? Next slide, please, Lena. So the central bank response will vary quite a lot depending on where the risk sits. So where vulnerability is concentrated in the public sector, the central bank will need to assess its government bond exposure, whereas concentrated in the private sector, the central bank will more easily reduce its own risk exposure by changing risk weightings or capital requirements on fossil fuel assets. And I've just put here our previous report in this sort of series, which outlines how ASEAN central banks can green their operations, and I'll link it later. So on to the recommendations of this report particularly. Next, Selena. So science-based taxonomies can be used to inform central bank decisions on greening, which activities contribute to climate objectives and deciding which do significant harm to these climate objectives. And by significant harm, this means that the activities, emissions levels, or other environmental impact are above a certain threshold, which means it hinders the country's ability to meet the climate goals. Of course, establishing this threshold is quite tricky. The EU platform on sustainable finance suggested using the average carbon intensity for the activity for electricity generation, and that will then, take any installation of a power plant above this average carbon intensity would then increase the overall carbon intensity of the EU. Or other thresholds can be calculated, based on calculations of the country's carbon budget development pathway, if the average carbon intensity might be seen as too high, or other activities might be seen as sort of always harmful, so to speak. Then you also have the potential role of entity-level transition taxonomies. So these can enable investor or bank engagement directly with companies on their transition, allowing them to determine whether companies are demonstrating the ambition and speed of change needed to align with climate targets. And this is really crucial we've seen last year, the explosion of sustainability linked bonds, and there's a sort of growing need to assess whether transition efforts are ambitious enough. And this will also be really important for the region to establish this high fossil fuel exposure. There'll be a lot of companies in need of looking to transition, and this will help determine whether or not these transitions are valid. And that's the report. Happy to take any questions, but yes, over to you, Selena.
Thank you very much, Lily. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I do apologize for the background noise. This is the default of working from home. So without much ado, let me please sort of invite our panelists to have our conversation. As you can tell, we have a stellar list of panelists here. We have A.G. Lin from Philippines, we have Luann from Malaysia, and we have Christina from Australia. And what we want to sort of discuss today is, where is ASEAN today? What is the practical implications? I think Lily has given us the policy point of view. I think ASEAN, in my experience, has grown leaps and bounds in the last 5 years. 5 years ago, we were trying to understand what a green bond was. And now we're talking about transition risk, we're talking about sustainability-linked loans, we're talking about transition bonds. So it's amazing how the financial markets in this side of the world has sort of leapfrogged in the last 5 years, and the level of sophistication and product innovation has really been exemplary in this region. But it cannot be sort of denied that we started off the work predominantly driven by the regulators and the kind of policy frameworks they put in place to guide the industry in this sort of direction. What I'm going to do is to start the conversation is I'm going to invite Christina. Christina from AFA, thanks so much for joining us, Christina. What I'd like you to start the conversation is, based on the research and the studies your organization has done, what are the kinds of tools that are available to help the financial sector meet these new transition risks and sort of adapt itself and redefine itself?
Right, so thanks, Zelina. Well, actually, if you don't mind, let me just start by saying that I think everybody can do more to manage climate financial risks. And many parties are still debating what role they can take, yeah? I also recognize that there's no one-size-fits-all answer. And in the case of central banks, I know that they have different histories, policy traditions, and mandates in different parts of the world. But over time, the role of central banks has evolved considerably and have often changed in response to crisis. So, for example, the 2008-2009 financial crisis recognized the need to reconsider the role of central banks in safeguarding financial stability. Fast forward today, we now recognize that climate risk is a financial risk, and therefore climate risk can impact financial stability. And this means that central banks will need to, again, reconsider what role it will play to contribute to greening the financial system. I'm aware that a growing number of central banks, including those in ASEAN, have already adopted green finance policies or guidelines, or have started to incorporate climate risk into macro-prudential frameworks. I think in CBI's research already mentioned the European Central Bank's asset purchase and collateral programs. Another tool, taxonomies, obviously, is another one that is being used as a tool to facilitate the management of climate risks. And through IEFA's research, we also found other initiatives that some central banks in the region have implemented as part of their responsibility to safeguard the future financial system. So, for example, China's PBOC and Japan's BOJ introduced lending facilities where the interest rates that are conditional to clean energy or carbon emission reduction activities. And the lending rates, at least in China PBOC's context, was something like 75 basis points below China's interbank and bond market funding. Essentially, this is a facility that provides discounted credit to banks that lend to entities that are engaged in carbon emission reduction. So that's another initiative that we found being implemented. But what's what we've found is that these programs actually started in December 2021 and have dispersed something like over 13 to 20 billion US dollars of credit to qualified banks. What we've also found is that this discounted credit facility actually promulgates the provision of verified decarbonization data in China. Because the loans that are offered under this lending facility are only extended to borrowers that are able to to produce proven, audited, and consistent decarbonization results. So this lending initiative ended up also being a capacity building exercise that transfers to domestic businesses and professionals. So that's one of the findings that we found in our research. But obviously, as with all policies, green initiatives, taxonomies, guidelines, are only good when there's strong enforcement and clear implementation. And I think this is where central banks can also do more of, and when they're considering what role they need to be taking.
Thanks, Christina. I think that's a very interesting key points that you mentioned. I think at the end of the day, and this is something Luann and I have discussed in the past, that you can have the regulatory framework, but the thing is that to actually move the financial sector, we need cheaper funding. Is that the only solution? Because once that comes in place, that sort of makes a difference in the market. But on that note, what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite AJ Lin. AJ Lin, thank you so much for joining us today. If you could share with us your experience in the Philippines in terms of what kind of regulatory frameworks that have been put in place across the financial sector, be it in public equity, asset management, or on the banking side, to facilitate this transition to become more sustainable in your financial sector, please.
Yeah, thank you, Zelina. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting the Bangko Sentral to be part of this webinar. Perhaps what I would share are the initiatives implemented by the Bangko Sentral to promote the sustainability agenda. But I would like to start by highlighting that the Philippine financial sector largely benefited from our strong collaboration with different stakeholders. Now, this includes development partners, fellow financial sector regulators, other government agencies, as well as regional international bodies promoting sustainable finance. The Bangko Sentral has adopted the sustainability agenda as one of its key strategic thrusts. We recognize, this was highlighted by Lily and again echoed by Christina, we recognize that the Bangko Sentral will play a very important role in promoting sustainable finance. So we adopted the Sustainable Central Banking Program, which describes the role of the BSP as enabler, mobilizer, and doer. So enabler is actually related to our role related to our function as supervisor. So we aim to promote a regulatory environment that would unlock and facilitate financing for green and sustainable investments. Now, as mobilizer, the BSP is also at the forefront of action by investing also in green and sustainable investment products, as well as we will endeavor to influence decisions of financial institutions in making these investments. In doing, we are adopting sustainable policies and practices, covering all areas of Bangko Sentral operations, and we are targeting to issue Bangko Sentral Sustainable Central Banking Strategy soon. So this would actually highlight all the strategies of the Bangko Sentral involving key areas of operations of the BSP. Now, let me focus on our role as an enabler. The BSP adopted a two-pronged approach in promoting sustainable finance in the financial sector. We started with an awareness building campaign, which included workshops and discussions with the banking industry. That was around 5 years before we issued the Sustainable Finance Framework. We also completed studies relevant to this area. One of the studies actually involved the assessment of the impact of extreme weather episodes from, I think, a span of 4 years on key safety and soundness indicators. Now, this activity is aimed at helping banks to better understand ESG risks We believe that in understanding this risk, we are enabling them to effectively manage this risk and also see the opportunities in this space. The second leg of this two-pronged approach is the issuance of the Sustainable Finance Framework in 2020, which mainstreamed the sustainable finance agenda in the financial industry. The framework emphasizes the importance of tone from the top in incorporating sustainability principles in corporate governance, risk management systems, as well as strategies of banks. We have set out clear responsibilities and accountabilities from the board of directors, as well as the three lines of defense, highlighting that the effective management of risk and seeing the opportunities is actually a shared responsibilities of all personnel in the organization. The issuance was followed by more specific risk management guidelines involving credit and operational risk, credit and operational ESG-related risk. The next leg of regulatory issuances will include guidelines on integration of sustainability principles and investment activities. We are also in the preparatory stage for the conduct of stress testing in the banking industry, as well as vulnerability assessment. This is in partnership with our development partners. Again, the learnings from this exercises will feed into development of stress testing guidelines for banks. We are also carefully looking at measures to incentivize banks to adhere to sustainability principles. We did not start with the incentives because this might not, properly embed ESG-related principles in their risk management systems and corporate governance frameworks, as well as strategy. Now, these incentives are looking at using the risk discounting loan facility also of the Bangko Sentral, giving preferential rates to green loans. Those are the areas that we're looking at. We have also proposed the inclusion of lending to sustainable projects as part of the mandatory compliance for Agri-Agra. This is a law under the this is a law in the Philippines wherein it requires banks to set aside 25% actually of loanable funds for the agriculture and agrarian sector. Now, if our lawmakers would allow sustainable projects to be part of one of the modes for compliance, I think that again, this would unlock significant opportunities to this agenda. On the national level, the BSP is also part of the interagency working group that we call as the Green Force. So we are co-chairing this with the Department of Finance, promoting, again, the sustainability agenda and aligning regulations across government agencies. The Green Force published just recently the Sustainable Finance Roadmap of the Philippines, as well as the guiding principles. The roadmap reflects broad plans of the country to promote sustainable finance, while the guiding principles identify sectors and activities aligned with this objective. The financial sector supervisors, again, it's a subset of the Green Force, created a working group now that will work on the harmonization of sustainability-related guidelines, disclosure, as well as taxonomy across the financial sector. I'll pause here, Zelina. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angeline. I think you make a very fair point. There's two ways to move the financial sector. One, we incentivize, as Christina has mentioned, in China. But the other thing is risk management, understanding your risk. I think the financial sector is so well aware of the credit risk, and we're ready to address credit risk. But ESG risk, with the lack of data, it's hard to sort of articulate ESG risk, and therefore it's still a very fluffy concept if we don't have the data to back it up in terms of recognizing it's a viable risk. On that note, Luen, I'm going to bring you into the conversation because you've been actually on the ground practicing it. It's easy for us to sort of say, oh, this is what should be done and this is what could be done, but you're the one who's actually doing it. So please share with us your experience. How has CIMB done it thus far?
Thank you, Zelina. So thank you for inviting me on this panel. And for those of you who are not too familiar with CIMB, we are an ASEAN-based bank headquartered out of Kuala Lumpur. We're all across ASEAN, with operations in 15 countries. We're about 150 billion USD in terms of asset size. So just a quick summary of who we are. So when we started looking at sustainability as a core part of our business, that was actually in late 2018. And yeah, it doesn't sound too long ago, but if you think about sustainability in financial services in ASEAN back in 2018, apart from in Singapore, actually there were no financial regulations, there's no taxonomy, there was almost nothing. So when we started, it was really thinking through what were the fundamental principles, what was the fundamental business case, and we were really kind of at the forefront together with the UNEP-FI, the United Nations Environment Program Finance Initiative, Principles for Responsible Banking. So we were one of the drafters for that. So really starting from scratch. And I think that there are advantages to moving first, but I guess now the part of the advantage is that you're ahead and you're kind of prepared for things to come. Part of the disadvantage is now that not all these taxonomies and regulations are coming in, and we've already started. So we now need to start retrofitting some of the things of what we're doing. Thank goodness we're on track and not a lot of rework needed. So I think for us, major cultural mindset, everything needed to shift. And because we had so little guidance, we really needed to leverage on our international network through Principles for Responsible Banking banks, as well as through NGOs. So for example, as I was saying to Christina, that when we were thinking about announcing our coal policy, and we were the first significant emerging market bank to say, okay, no coal and exit coal by 2040, we had to rely heavily on NGOs and thought leaders to kind of think about, how do we do this? What should we do? What shouldn't we do? Even for net zero, we were the first bank in ASEAN to commit to Net Zero Banking Alliance and GFANs. And really, we needed that external network. I think now we have a lot more parties within the country, be it regulators and different stakeholders, peer banks as well, who are doing things. So now there's a support network. But really, I think banks, local banks, especially in the country, shouldn't get trapped in kind of looking at each other and thinking what my neighbor bank is doing is best practice, because actually there's a lot more going out there. And that's why I think I would really encourage my fellow bankers to be part of these international networks and working groups. And just the final point on this is and I think all of you would be very well aware of this, that you can't be, sustainability is not an area where one party can do everything. It really needs an entire ecosystem, and it's really about helping to drive that ecosystem and change that mindset all across that ecosystem. So for example, just within our own team, we had to do multiple pilots to show our risk team that, hey, this physical risk is real and it's going to impact X% of our mortgage very, very soon. With the regulators, we're working with the Securities Commission and Bank Negara on JC3, trying to build that regulatory framework with peers through the UNPRB and with customers. So we're having an annual conference called the Cooler Earth, just to bring people on board and kind of build that awareness. And with our clients, the CEO Action Network. So I think, we can't just although we are individual private companies, yes, we are to some extent, to a large extent impacted by what's out there. But at the same time, we can't sit back and play victim. We have to say, okay, this needs to be done. Nobody's doing it. Okay, let's get together. Let's get somebody together, group together, and let's start doing it. Because if every party is thinking, okay, it's not my problem, the government needs to do this, central bank needs to do this, then nothing's going to happen. So yeah, okay, back to you, Zelina.
Thanks, Luan. You very key point, and that's one I realized in my sort of experience in this space. It's a network. Everyone, I think what's great about climate change is everyone they do recognize that everyone has a role. Everyone has to do more, and that we can't do it individually. And there's a support network that you can leverage on domestically and internationally, and that open source of sharing of information and experience has been great, I think, to push that sort of traction, especially in ASEAN. But now I'm just going to narrow down the rest of the conversation around taxonomies. That's like the buzzword at the moment. Everyone wants to have a taxonomy. Everyone wants to have an opinion. I mean, the background behind a taxonomy makes sense. One of the things that the feedback from all the stakeholders is, what does this mean? What are the definitions? What are the different thresholds? Investors were struggling is, what is a good climate change initiative? What's not? Banks needed to know what's green, what's brown, what's red, and stuff like that. And so the regulators have come out and said, okay, let's come up with a taxonomy to give direction. Now, my first question on taxonomies is, AJ Lin, you said that when you started the whole sustainability journey of sort of revamping the financial sector, you spent a lot of time on awareness and sort of coaching and giving regulatory frameworks. Now, the question is, in your experience, in your opinion, do you think the financial sector in the Philippines is ready for a taxonomy? Because a taxonomy has several implications. It immediately puts up front what is possible and what's not possible, what you need to move away in terms of investing or funding or financing. Do you think the financial sector is ready?
That's actually a difficult question, Zadina. Yes or no, we have to be ready as of yesterday for this one too. But again, the issuance of the Philippine Guiding Principles that was late last year flags and signals that the country is ready for the adoption of a taxonomy. Although the guiding principles already identify specific sectors and activities that are aligned with the sustainability agenda, it should be complemented by guidelines, specific, more detailed guidelines that would facilitate its adoption in the financial sector. Now, the financial sector supervisors under the interagency body called the Financial Sector Forum, so that includes the BSP, the SEC, and our Insurance Commission, would work on these guidelines. And we wanted to call it as a taxonomy applicable to us, but we will build on the ASEAN taxonomy version 1. So there are several advantages, and you've mentioned those advantages associated with the development of the taxonomy. But we recognize, and we are quite scared in carrying out this task because also of the challenges and the factors that we have to consider. So let me just mention 3 of these challenges of factors. First, we always have to be sensitive to the state of economic development in the country, keeping in mind that recovery, growth, and development should be continuously supported. So the adoption of the taxonomy should not drastically limit financing to sectors that are not yet ready to transition due to different reasons, such as availability, say, of more affordable alternative energy sources, inadequate resources on their part, among others, as this may have negative repercussions also on the economy. But let's look at, for instance, the micro, small, and medium enterprises, which are the backbone of most of the emerging market economies, including the Philippines. The MSMEs may not be well equipped to transition due to resource challenges and knowledge gaps. So we have to carefully tread on this work to avoid any unintended consequences. So that's one area that we are carefully looking at and evaluating. Second, the banking industry is in varied stages of maturity, understanding or becoming aware and adopting the sustainability agenda. We are talking about different levels of capability to adopt the taxonomy. On one hand, we have what we call as the first mover banks that are very much ahead than the other banks. These banks have dedicated sustainability finance office or desk and have issued green, social, or sustainability bonds. In fact, since 2017, 7 local banks have issued around 152.9 billion pesos of peso denominated and 1.3 billion US dollars foreign currency denominated green, social, and sustainability bonds, and of which we have 2 banks that issued social bonds to finance or refinance needs of eligible MSMEs. On the other hand, we have mid-sized and community banks serving the vulnerable sectors, including micro, small, and medium enterprises. Now, these mid-sized and community banks may not be adequately, again, equipped to adopt the taxonomy. this highlights a very important point in developing those guidelines, that the taxonomy should provide adequate flexibility that would allow proportionate implementation, considering the size and capability of our financial institutions. That's to promote adoption of these standards across the banking industry. Now, for the third issue, we've mentioned this already, it's on the availability and quality of data. Data collection is challenging because of the current data collection that we are using. It's not designed to disaggregate data based on ESG considerations. I think this was also highlighted in the report of Lily. This again poses a question not only on the availability of information, but also on the resources and capability to call the data, collect the data, and the platform that we will use. Another issue in implementing the taxonomy is the capability to measure. Now, this is the science-based thing, the thresholds that we should set for the sector or counterparty. I think these are also the issues considered in the development of the ASEAN taxonomy version 1. Now, this taxonomy is principles-based and considers the different levels of economic development of its member states. So each jurisdiction is given adequate leeway to tweak and implement it in a manner that is suited to domestic conditions. That's why we have the fundamental and the advanced approach. So not to belabor the point, but let me just end by saying the strong collaboration with other stakeholders will accelerate actions in promoting sustainable finance. So I'll pause here again, Selena. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, A.G. Lin. Christina, I'm going to pose the next question to you. Reflecting on what A.G. Lin says, I think the challenge is right. All regulators, especially in ASEAN, face the same issues. We're talking about job loss, economic revenue loss. We're talking about the fact that most of the economies in this side of the world are driven by SMEs, and therefore it's a huge leap for us to sort of educate them and create awareness in that space. In your experience and based on the research that IF has done, we've gone down the route of using taxonomy as the lowest hanging fruit to cause transition in finance in this side of the world. Do you think, in your opinion, taxonomy is actually an effective tool? Loaded question there, Christina.
It's a trick question. I feel it's a trick question. I think the best answer in a very succinct way is it depends and it's complicated. So I think, look, so if taxonomies are developed to better channel funds to proven technologies that are environmentally friendly, low emitting, and for the purpose of meeting the Paris Agreement, then a taxonomy that adheres to scientifically backed, to scientific evidence, in theory, could be effective. If meeting the Paris goals is the main goal, but the taxonomy is designed to balance all stakeholders' interests, all parties' interests, then I'm not so sure. So that's my, in a nutshell, kind of answer.
No, great response. Thanks, Christina. And I'm going to take your response and I'm going to bring it to Luan, because Luan's the one who has to roll it out, right? So Luan, principle-based taxonomy or science-based taxonomy, I see here where A.G. Lin is coming. I think all regulators want to provide a facilitative environment, but recognize the challenges of making the transition, right? So from a practitioner's point of view, what kind of taxonomy works for you?
I think three big things really when it comes to taxonomy. And the first is clarity. I mean, that is the purpose of a taxonomy in the first place. So what is it for? Why is, whoever doing it? Because with that, the clarity of the long-term purpose, then you get real impact, real change, and not just box ticking. Because if it's a rules ABC, it's box ticking. But if you give a long-term purpose, then people actually know what you're trying to get to and can try and do some of that. But the second thing is, very importantly, clarity of definition. So what exactly is acceptable? What is not acceptable? And, if you've got 5 banks, well, the 5 banks have 5 different interpretations of what is acceptable or not. And how do you do that? I think the ASEAN taxonomy with the plus standards, those are, well, in theory, good. We'll see what happens when they come out. The second thing is this, balance between ambition, the alignment to Paris, but also achievability. If there is something that's so ambitious that you can't achieve it, then we won't even bother trying. Yeah. So, for example, just to give an example of our own SDG bond, when we were trying to get a second party opinion, we wanted to put waste collection infrastructure. And there are many parts of ASEAN where we operate where there's zero infrastructure. But the response that we got, apparently from the view of global investors, is that, I'm sorry, if you don't have separation at source and recycling, then it doesn't count. But I'm like, hello, these guys are just throwing stuff into the ocean at the moment. So isn't, a waste collection system without recycling and without separation at source, isn't that better? So anyway, that balance between ambition and what is realistic. Of course, we need to be careful that achievability and being realistic is not an excuse for delay, but that is another long conversation for another day. And finally, third thing is efficiency and how we're going to operationalize it. So can you imagine when a taxonomy comes out and you've got a client has 5 banks and they get slightly different questions from from the various banks? Can you imagine what a terrible burden, and it is be such a horrible and loathsome task, right? So how do we try and reduce these redundancies in the system so that the banks are all operating or the FIs are operating in kind of a seamless manner instead of everyone coming up with their own thing? So yeah, 3 things from me. Thank you.
Okay, great way to end the webinar, Luann. I absolutely agree with you. I think we need some sort of definition which puts everyone on the same page in terms of understanding what is right and what's wrong, and what is doable and what's not doable. What are the thresholds that we should all be adhering to instead of everyone coming up with their own interpretations. But reflecting on what A.G. Lin says, I think the reality in ASEAN economies is we need to create that balance between ambition and what is realistic. I think that's a great way to end the webinar. Thank you so much. I do apologize. We haven't had time to answer the questions, but what we will do is we'll try to draft the answers and respond to the audience post this webinar. On that note, I'd like to thank all of you, Christina, A.G. Lin, Luann, Lily. Thank you so much for joining us. And really appreciate everyone's opinions. And to the audience, thank you for joining us. We hope you found it useful. And please join us at other Climate Bonds Initiative events going forward. Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Alina.